For early access plus exclusive content, facilitated discussions, live one-on-one Q&As, and more, become a patron at patreon.com/BrucePoinsett. Welcome back to the Blacktastic Adventure, a virtual exploration of Oregon's Black diaspora. I am your host, Bruce Poinsett. And on today's episode, I speak with Liz Fouther-Branch and Bobby Fouther. Before I read their intros for you, just a quick note that this is actually a special episode in that originally when we recorded this interview, it was actually meant for another podcast project. And we're going to be talking specifically about the issue of restitution and the work of the Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association, too, in Portland. But the project it's on the shelf right now. However, Mr. Bobby and Miss Liz, they are, prolific artists and educator in their own respects. And, there's just so many gems and, just great things that came from this interview that, it would have been a shame not to, share it with people. So we have a special Blacktastic restitution special. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about Miss Liz and Mr. Bobby. Liz Fouther-Branch, B.S.E, M.S.E, is a retired educator turned historical storyteller and equity facilitator that has spent more than 40 years working and volunteering for arts and youth development organizations. She has spent the last 20 years as a consultant on arts education and programming development, social justice, capacity building, and advocacy. In her spare time, Liz enjoys researching family ancestry and crochet. Bobby Fouther is a visual and performing artist born and raised in the Northwest. He is inspired by everything from birth to death, and his passions are painting, photography, dance, theater, and graphics. Over the past 50 years, he has invested his talents in Portland, Oregon, as well as statewide, serving as an artist in education and on numerous boards and committees. His recognitions include the Spirit of Portland, Independent Spirit, and Lowenstein Trust Awards. So with that, I'm just gonna get right into, my interview with Ms. Liz and Mr. Bobby, because again, they have, it's one thing capturing both their work, capturing the history of, the area where Emmanuel Hospital now stands, but then also just just that sibling dynamic and that interplay is always fascinating to watch. And they just have their archive of just family photos is a tool in itself of not just capturing the history of the community, but then also as something that is very much relevant right now as part of EDPA 2 in fighting for restitution for the families who were displaced. So again, it's a very fascinating interview, a lot of family history, a lot of neighborhood history, a lot of discussion around art and putting a lot of things in context and, really illuminating people to some of the subtleties of this process. So I think you're going to learn a lot and I think you're going to really enjoy it. Check it out. Yeah, so we're talking about this idea of restitution and, using what's happened with the Emmanuel Hospital and the displacement that happened from it. So I think just to bring it back for context, as people who lived in the sort of the Emmanuel neighborhood, or not Emmanuel neighborhood, but the neighborhood that was there, can y'all just talk about, I guess, frame it as far as time-wise and I guess what the neighborhood was like before, basically, Emmanuel is one thing. There's also, I-5 and the Coliseum, but can y'all just talk about the neighborhood kind of before, these sort of mass displacement events?
Well, I know when we lived in that area, at first we lived on Borthwick, and I can't remember the exact address, but it was down in that area. Then at a point in time, I think after my sister was born, we moved up to Ganbine and I can't remember the cross street.
Morris.
But Morris, block away from Dawson Park. And so from 1 through 7 years old, basically that was our environment in terms of the house we lived in. Well, actually it was a duplex because the Hamiltons lived upstairs. And that was our area of, let's see, for me, I guess, play, whoopings. I tried to go to the store across Vancouver Avenue and Williams. There was a store nearby, and I was, let's say I was maybe a little too young to do that by myself, but I was not unafraid to do it by myself. So, you know, so that was the neighborhood of those types of events. And then most of the kids we played with lived in that area, and our school was in that area, and our great aunt was in that area, which she served as our grandmother because our grandmother passed when my mom was 16. So the family lived there.
And basically our great aunt, her name was Della Williams, she lived 2 blocks away from where our duplex was. And she had been in the neighborhood, and actually in dealing with this whole Emmanuel Hospital displacement issue, it made me go back and trace when she moved in that neighborhood. And she actually moved into that house somewhere between 1934 and 36 after getting married, and stayed there until they displaced them, basically, which was probably around 1961-ish, 62. And then I think she died like a year or 2 later after being moved. So yeah, we spent just as much time, what I remember is we spent just as much time at her house as we did at our house. Because
probably more, because our mom had to work.
Right.
She was a single parent, so she had to work. And basically our aunt, like I said, she was our aunt, great aunt / grandma in that sense of the word, because that's where we were.
Right.
When we weren't with her.
So going to school, like if we were sick, she would come and get us. Everything was in walking distance, everything. And then what I really remember is that all of our neighbors seemed like they were extended family. They all knew who we were. They knew who she was. They knew who our mom was. So there wasn't any unsafe place. I don't remember feeling unsafe until we moved 8 or 9, what is it, like 9 blocks up. Because we actually moved before our aunt moved. We got displaced. People who were renting got displaced first, I do believe.
Much earlier than they're claiming in the document.
Oh, and that was the other thing I was going to say, Bruce. Most people claim that the displacement started in the whatever. I've heard different dates from 60 to 1970. We moved, my mom remarried, and we moved in 1957. 1957. So displacement was already going on. There wasn't any point that I can recall that it wasn't going on. It may not have been going on for everybody. It might have been harder to displace people who owned their homes, like my aunt. But renters were coming in and going out all the time. However,
and we don't know what landlords heard versus what we heard. Right. And then as little children, we weren't involved in
You're not involved in that.
You know, so all we knew was, okay, well, we're all packed up and we're leaving here.
Right.
Bye, Elantine. Bye, Benny. Bye.
And so, yeah, that to me, because I was younger, was a much more, I think, traumatic. I remember that. I remember being excited because my mom bought a house and I'd have my own room, supposedly. But I also remember moving further away from my aunt, further away from my friends that I felt really close to. And Elantine was one of them, who lived right upstairs. And so that was kind of scary. And then when
Because we were considered past walking distance.
right.
So we no longer could walk through the neighborhood that we were used to our great aunt's house, even though we were only 9 blocks away.
Right.
For us, that might have been 9
Might have been 9 miles.
900 miles.
Because we were so young. Once we got older and we could walk the neighborhood more, some of that comfort came back because we could go back and forth. But yeah, well, we were pretty, I mean, I was like 5, 6.
You were 5, I was 7.
When we moved. So I couldn't go walk anywhere. So that just meant I didn't get to see her as often. I didn't get to see her every day.
Except to school with me.
Right.
That was our radius.
And unless my brother, and actually what I do remember is like we would go to school from the house on Shaver after we moved, and then we could go walk down to Aunt Della's and stay there till my mom came to pick us up. I do remember that. But literally, if I got sick in school or whatever, my aunt could just walk a block and come get me. You know what I mean? So, or walk 2 blocks, I guess it was.
2 blocks, yeah.
So, or she could send a neighbor. Like everybody knew each other, even the teachers knew, lived in the neighborhood. Everybody knew each other. It didn't matter if you were white, everybody knew each other. If my aunt couldn't come get me, she could send Miss Houston or some, and everybody knew each other. So that kind of changed when we got to Shaver. So, even though we stayed at the same school.
So, you talk about basically being at a really young age, when the family was displaced. And I'm just curious, like, when did you like kind of get more of that context of like why that happened? Like, about like how old you all may have been?
Adult?
Really? No, I think I got it earlier than that. The interesting thing about my great aunt, her daughter worked for the Urban League. And even though we're supposed to be seen and not heard, I was real nosy. So I listened to a lot of stuff. And so I heard some of the battles about forcing people to move and forcing them out of their home. And then when my great aunt and my cousins moved, the neighborhood they went into, it was like the raisin in the sun. The people didn't want them there. They were all white people. They moved to historic Irvington. People didn't want them there, and they were going to pay for them to not move. So by that time, I'm like 7 or something like that. Now, I don't remember, as I'm giving you more detail than I remember, but I do remember that the neighborhood people didn't want them there. I remember that because I could not figure out, and I was always asking, like, why don't they want them there? They're nice. They're nice, and the babies are cute, because that's what little kids think. My cousin is cute. Why don't you want her there? So that's what it was for me. I do remember that part.
I don't, because our lives, even though we're brother and sister, are very separate things, okay? And so me being into, and yes, I have been an artist all my life, starting with my lipstick design on my sister in her crib when I was really young. But anyway, so I don't remember some of those things because I didn't have to stay at home with the adults. She was around the adults more. And then my mom kept her with her more than she kept me with her, because I kind of started to get out and do things. I'm 2 years older. So, my mom would let me go do this and that and the other thing, and she didn't have to cart me around and drop me off, where girls are very different, especially back in those days. And so you had to be escorted around in order to safely get from point A to point B.
Yeah, it was a different time period, because I do have to say Bobby was responsible for me for like getting to school, getting home. But even my grandfather sometimes would meet us outside the school and walk us if he was off. He worked for the railroad, so he would come pick us up if he was off, or he would drop us off if he was off. But when we did get old enough where it was more or less Bobby and I, he had to escort me everywhere. Like I could not go places by myself. And I think it stayed like that till I was in 6th or 7th, 8th grade, maybe. I had outside friends and I could play with them, but all of our friends were mutual. So they all had brothers or sisters Bobby's age. And then they had brothers and sisters my age. And so then we would all play together.
Right.
Me going
technically everybody was brothers and sisters.
Yeah. Me going
that was in the day where somebody else's mama could whoop your
right. Then there was that. Then there was that.
And I started to say ass, but okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, y'all can curse if you want to. It's okay.
Well, yeah, that's when all the parents had control of all the kids, because if they saw you around the corner, you knew that it got home before you did.
Oh man. And that was real. That was real. Because literally my mom, like she would get home from work, she knew like everything we did. So basically neighbors, if we did something that looked a little different or screwy, or we weren't in a place we were supposed to be in, my mother knew it by the time she got home from work. And like after a while, it was like, does she really have eyes in the back of her head, or can she fly? And she know, because it used to be when I was younger, it was like, how does she know that? And then, so there was a whole routine to go into school. There was a whole routine to get home. We'd vary within a block or two or a friend or two on the way to and from. But basically, people knew like there was the same lady came to pick us every Sunday to go to church when my mom was at work. And she had a cane, but she could walk faster than we could. What was her name, Bobby?
Mrs. Cornelius.
Yeah, Mrs. Cornelius. Every Sunday. We were going to church.
So basically, we were just a neighborhood full of parents who had kids, and they made sure all the kids stayed together. And the one thing I do remember is that pretty much the only white people I ever saw were at school.
Or daycare, because what was the lady's name?
Daycare, Miss Collins.
Miss Collins.
We were at her daycare, but we were also at Miss Booker's daycare.
That's true. Right.
So the neighborhood was really well woven into itself, regardless of the church you went to, because we went to multiple churches between St. Philip's Episcopal and AME Zion. I remember waffles and maple syrup at St. Philip's, and coconut cake with the pineapple in between, and the frosting turn crunchy on the second day. So we had that kind of woven village persona, from neighborhood. And then Liz went to like everybody's church. She had lots and lots and lots of friends like that. I was not such a social butterfly. I was more into my artwork. So you could close me off in a room and I'd stay there for weeks. But we were still close knit like that.
Right. Our church home was St. Philip's. Our step grandmother went to Mount Zion, AME Church. But then,
originally it was behind the social club. Oh my gosh, senior moment. Billy Webb.
Oh,
originally the church was behind Billy Webb's social club today. It was kind of like in the middle of the block, because we would walk around the corner from her house. And so, and I pop pictures online for the people who know us. And so whenever you see me, well, no, I was in a suit way more often than I chose to be, partially because of my great aunt and partially because of hand downs. I know one of my outfits was Cleophas Smith's from the hand downs. And that's how parents would do everything for their children. They would just, you know, like they say, take that dollar and make it go around the neighborhood 12 times or 20 times. That's what everyone did with everything we had here, because this, you know, Portland is basically a white city, and so everything wasn't that friendly.
Right. And even with when you were saying like Cleophas, the hand-me-downs, they had married couples clubs. So my mom was in one called Idlewild. So they did everything together, and that's where they did the clothes exchanges. They had book clubs.
They had dances.
Money for dances, parties. And they'd have the parties. So it'd be like the Hawaiian party in the spring, and then some, and we have some pictures of that too. Urban League gave parties.
Or just social parties at your house. You know, we inherited like 100 years of family photos. And so in going through all of those photos, we kept seeing things like our great aunt in a dress gown and the man she was dancing with in a tuxedo. And it was at her house, in her living room, dining room, and all the furniture was moved out of the way. So people kept their social construct regardless of the surrounding events, you know, in the Portland, Oregon area during that era.
You couldn't go everywhere. All the social clubs didn't necessarily let you in. And this is actually even probably, I think Cotton Club came up right about that time, if I remember, because Paul Knowles, I was going to say Uncle Paul Knowles was younger than my parents. And so somebody had the club, Mr. Stewart had the club before him. But there were clubs and cafes, and actually there were a lot of them, but they were had been in lower, what they called, and that's the other thing about Albina. It was lower Albina, which was closer to the Coliseum. And as they started displacing us, you know, with the freeway and Coliseum, it kept moving the neighborhood up. So what they call Albina, like where we were kind of fighting over this land, I guess, that was Central Albina. Actually, it was Central Williams District. That's what it was called. And it wasn't until you got to like Fremont and above that it was actually the Albina area. So names have changed, developers have changed the name, Portland Development Commission, all the different city council, they've changed the names of the neighborhood and everything. So which is real interesting to me, because they did not keep track of who the Black people were. So when people did get displaced, more than half of them that they displaced, they have no record on. And that's another whole interesting piece of that too, because like we were renting, they didn't have us on a displacement list, but they had my great aunt on a displacement list, right? So.
And partially, I would say the reason they didn't was because they literally considered the Negroes of that time a problem. So anything to stop the Negroes from congregating in a specific area would stop them from being a problem. I just posted a quote on Facebook about that by Ira Keller. And it's pretty disgusting, but it's the truth of the time. You know, because that's how we were shuffled around and herded from place to place. And it was a bigger design than just us in Albina. It definitely had national construct, because if you pull up the national red line areas, or if you actually pull up Portland and its red line areas, they
Right.
literally scooped out area after area that was congregated by minorities, immigrants, etc.
Right. Because the assumption is too that all the Black folks prior to Vanport lived in Albina, but in reality, the majority of the Black folks and the churches were in downtown Portland in the Northwest side, and the Southwest side, as far over as like Goose Hollow. So.
Right, and other places. Our mom grew up on East Burnside.
Right, so there wasn't the thought that we have always kind of been in this neighborhood prior to Vanport, which was the biggest influx of Black folks here. And they did not really want them in the city. So when they did put them in the city, they dumped them all in Albina. Okay. The Black community was all over. There were people who lived on the Southwest side. There were people who lived in Ladd's Addition. Our doctor lived in Ladd's Addition. People lived kind of all over, but the majority, there was a whole group that did live in Albina. A lot of them were railroad men, because it was within walking distance of going down to the railroad yard. And there were waiters and porters and stuff like that. So that was sort of like a railroad neighborhood. And people that worked down on the docks, down at the waterfront, or Swan Island. Right. So in the ship, but in the shipyards, but not the Kaiser shipyards. Right. So.
And then I forgot, never mind. Go ahead.
Well,
that's all I have on that.
So that kind of transitions nicely into the next part, which, there have been efforts over the years as far as getting restitution for this. And, I just want to quickly say, before we hit the record on this, y'all actually, help correct me, because I've been using the word reparations kind of almost, interchangeably with it. And it's very, very important to distinguish those. So first off, can you just quickly talk about kind of like why it's so important to distinguish the two? And then can you just talk about some of the efforts specifically with a manual?
Currently, because we have been dealing with the city, the housing authority, and Emmanuel
Development Commission.
Yeah.
And the Development Commission, right.
And the Development Commission. Every time they have come out with something that would go to the press so that they could, quote unquote, tell their story, they use the word reparations, which is a hot box word for the United States, because we haven't dealt with slavery, okay? And people working for free, and it's time for you to pay up. What we're talking about is stealing from people, stealing what people purchased and paid for, and not giving them proper compensation. And what they used to do was, for the people who did get some money from things, they would lower the value of the house, similar to today. Pretty much nothing's changed, okay? So it's a bigger racial issue than everybody wants to chalk up to. However, for this specific case, we've been using restitution in our verbiage with them, and they have been using reparations in their verbiage with us to try to flip the script, flip the narrative. And it's almost like we don't know how to read or something like that, which we're way past that point these days.
Or just the fact that reparations is for chattel slavery. That's what it's for. Restitution is a one-to-one replacement for a house that was taken, stolen, by eminent domain. And then people like my great aunt, they never got money for their house. And yet if you look in Portland Prosper's records, in the city of Portland's records, they say, oh, we gave people money. No, they didn't. They did not give everyone money.
Well,
Some
then
people,
when you ask where are the records, oh, we don't have them.
right. Or even we don't know how many houses. I mean, so it's kind of like they play this game between we don't know how many houses were actually lost, which they don't. They say it was somewhere between 100 and 200 houses, but Emmanuel Hospital's goal in their original plan was 19 square blocks. That's more than a couple of hundred houses. I don't know if they got to all 19 square blocks. I don't think that they did, but pretty much all the blocks around them, like where their parking lot is down in the back houses, everything around immediately. I mean, hospital was like 2 buildings, probably maybe 3, because even nursing school, they were going to have a nursing school there, and that was like the addition of a 4th building. But right. Emmanuel Hospital that was into was only like 3 buildings.
We lived across the street.
With a parking lot right around it. It didn't even have the Red Cross. That's where we lived, you know?
Well, so we lived, the exact house that we rented in is now the Emmanuel Hospital parking lot.
Parking lot.
Our great aunt's house is the Red Cross parking lot, which is on that campus. Right.
So that's what I'm saying. That hospital complex was surrounded by houses. So we don't really, we don't really know how many houses were lost. They did not keep a record. When they did start keeping it, it was closer to like the 1960s. And that's how Aunt's house got caught, you know, that got caught in there. But say our Lord decided to pull out because he's moving to the suburbs, because likely that landlord was white. You know, they have paid him. But what now, the interesting thing too is City Club had you know how they do their little studies, to do the studies back then. The 1950 study, the majority of people that they were actually taking houses from were elderly whites, elderly Black folks. It wasn't even the families, it was initially the seniors, because they're gonna die and not live in their houses anyway, right? And that's basically how that article reads. It's when Dr. Unthank was City Club, who's a Black man. And so they had a tendency to tell a little bit more truth right there. And Ira wasn't running, because there is Ira Keller and 2 or 3 other people. The guy that was the mayor at the time, Ira Keller, guy that spent 7 years being the head on the board of Emmanuel Hospital, longer. It takes Bird to tell you who all the people are, because I don't remember who all the people are. Just in the research, there were 4 or 5. There was somebody, Ira Keller was from the Realty Board, somebody from Emmanuel Hospital, the guy that ended up being alongside Ira Keller, who started Development Commission and the Housing Authority. So there was these 5 or 6 men that were kind of like in everything, and then they were intimidating everybody else, basically.
So you mentioned Bird, and that also kind of goes into, you know, the Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association.
EDPA too.
EDPA too. Yeah. Can you talk about, or just share what the organization is and the work you all are doing, just for context?
Initially, at the time that this was all taking place, there was an organization started, EDPA, Emmanuel Displacement Persons Association, and they were fighting this because they realized what was happening and how it was happening, and they felt this is illegal, something is wrong with this process. So they spent lots of time fighting it. And if you go back in the articles in the newspapers, You will see glowing Emmanuel Hospital plans this sprawling campus, and you will see neighborhood is thoroughly opposed to it.
Right.
Because
Like now.
they're just going to bulldoze people's houses.
Right.
Whether you owned it or not.
And that was Miss Lee.
All in the name of, what's the word they use a lot? When they're improving your neighborhood. So they
blighted.
say, no,
what,
blighted, not blighted. Well, that blight is another story. That's actually a whole nother.
Urban renewal, maybe?
Yes, urban renewal. When they want to have urban renewal take place, they will condemn or call blight, or in the essence of Ira Keller, they were wanting to not have a Negro ghetto.
Right.
That's where it was designated that the Negro was a problem. Never mind that we had businesses, churches, our own things. And if you probably would have left us alone, Portland was pretty fast becoming another Black Wall Street, like Tulsa. And, you know,
and a music mecca.
The design was to, oh gosh, like Tulsa, they threw real bombs on it and went in and killed everybody and took the stuff out of their houses and took it home. Well, here they threw a blight bomb on our neighborhood.
And claimed eminent domain.
In order to destroy what was going on.
Right.
With the people of color in that area. We were thriving.
And we were becoming a music mecca. This is where, you know, I don't know what they call it now, was straight ahead jazz back in the day. You know, just another form of jazz. And that's where it was becoming really popular here before it kind of went to Finn. So, yeah. So there were businesses, cafes. Bird's grandparents owned a tavern, I think, a couple other buildings. You know, Mr. Marshall owned his business down there, who lived on the corner from my aunt. There were a lot of people who owned businesses that, or they were leasing. And actually where the blight was coming from, because this was another thing that I read, when they did have the white business owners move out, they just let their businesses go to shambles. They didn't do anything to keep them up. And that's how they could get the blight designation. So one of the things that Bird always harps on is the houses look normal. Some of them were extremely well kept up. She has pictures of that. And some of them, I mean, by the time my aunt is living in her house, she's in her 60s. Basically, by the time we're of any age. So it might need to be painted, or, you know, need a new porch, or we got a new porch on our house when we moved into it on share. But nevertheless, that kind of work, yeah, but really calling them blighted or shacks. There were apartments that were down by the Memorial Coliseum. That's when they did the freeway. That they were in really bad shape and they were extremely overcrowded. And that's Mr. Bowles was talking about that, because they lived down there, which is very interesting because his dad and his brothers, they owning a lot of Portland property. Even though that's where they started out, was in these kind of round shanty kind of housing. But that's because the landlords, you know, they were slumlords. They weren't fixing anything. You had to fix stuff. And I remember people telling me that too. You had to fix stuff yourself. But pretty much everybody that we grew up around, they were buying property and selling property to people or renting to people. So that's what the Black folks were doing.
And the issue is, especially when we got our photos, family photos, what we have in our family photos completely contradicts what the city, the housing authority said, and the development commission. because if you want to use the word ghetto, okay, and we use the televised stereotype of it, there was none of that going on. Our streets were like vacuumed once a week. Or let me change it, swept once a week by the little mamas and grandmas and the aunts who would get out there and sweep the street. So at the point it became really obviously contradictory to what was going on. That's kind of at the same time that we joined Bird and the committee, etc. Because
Right.
It's like, no, what you're saying, I have physical proof that that's not true. So it's been that kind of party.
There were bridge clubs where people played a card game called canasta. There were, like the big thing to do, particularly for kids, is people had like section of their house where you just worked on puzzles.
Mhm.
We did the same thing everybody else did. You
Right.
know what I mean? We went to church on Sunday, choir, as Bobby was talking. A lot of my friends were PK, so that's why I'd end up being at so many churches. And I'd be singing
PK
in that
means
choir.
preacher's kid for the people who do not know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Almost every friend I had, I mean, I think except for maybe one, they were all PK kids. So we would go to churches, all the functions, the plays were at the churches.
Mhm.
Dances were at the churches or at Matt Dishman.
Except for Billy Webb Social Club. That used to be
That was the Y.
YWCA, and they
Mhm.
literally designated that the colored Y
Right.
because the servicemen didn't have any place to go when they came here. So they
Right.
gave that spot to what's that called? The SRO or whatever.
The designation for USO Center.
Right,
USO.
USO Center. So that was a designated center for the colored troops. Okay, so I mean, there's so much history here that people are misconstruing or rewriting, revising to suit their needs, where we literally have proof that you're lying. There, I said it. I get away with these things because I'm an artist.
The other thing is people were coming here like Roland Hayes. Y'all gonna have to
Marian
look.
Anderson, Paul
Marian,
Robeson,
right. A lot of
programs from their shows.
the railroad were really good at making sure, because a lot of guys were out of Chicago, Detroit, DC, New York. They had a little network, and the Masons, just the different organizations would get together and they would host dances and stuff and have people come, or performances. And so in those days, you're struggling to perform at the whatever Fairmont downtown. Well, actually, the was a movie theater. What did they have downtown, Bobby? Civic Auditorium?
No, not back in that
back
time.
in the day.
It was
But
the
anyway,
theaters. The
you couldn't
theaters and
perform at
things
those
like
places.
Neighbors of Woodcraft and
Right.
the bigger white social organizations that would have a whole hall to themselves. Right. It was those organizations where they would have the dances, etc., and that club that was down on Williams Avenue. But I think the biggest thing is that because we took it upon ourselves to have our own life and lifestyle, this was what did not bode well with the organizations that ran things.
There's lots I have of, colored women's clubs having social functions at people's houses. My great aunt's best friend, we called her Aunt May. She was a caterer. She was listed here as a caterer. She never was listed as a servant of any kind. She hired women from the church to cater parties with her. She has pictures of her catering the parties. Her husband was really high up in the Masons, and actually that was Elantine Hamilton's grandparents. So yeah, so there were lots of social functions. I have another picture that's like, it's one of the Mason Hall, I think it's Masons and Eastern Stars, if I remember correctly, in front of their building that they owned. And there's like maybe 100 people out there. We made our own social life.
Are we answering your questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to kind of go back. You talked earlier about sort of, when we were talking about the difference between reparations and restitution, how like reparations is a word the city is kind of like used to basically like diminish what you're talking about.
Correct.
Can you just talk a little bit more about, because I think for, the rest of us, we see the press releases, we see
exactly
stuff, but like, can you talk a little bit about sort of like the behind the scenes, how it goes down behind the scenes with these discussions? And
EDPA2 over the years has had numerous conversations, probably with numerous mayors. Even in Bird's rendition of this organization now, she's tried to come up with ideas that would support the community and help it build wealth. Because they also make it sound like these few Black folks want all the money and the rest of the folks can go somewhere else. And that's not the case at all. She's gone to the mayor and come up with ideas and concepts that would help communities build wealth. While she's trying to recruit and find out who are actually people that were living in the neighborhood. That didn't go over well. They didn't want to hear that before they put it in what they call the TIF. And I'll talk about that in a minute. They have since, what the restitution is, basically what we're asking for now is like, if you don't want to work with any of the rules that or any of the things we're asking for that could improve things for Black folks in the community, then why don't you just give us one-to-one restitution for cost, pay it.
And then let's do a little bit of backstory there. This is because the city came up with a committee to work on things, the project working group. And excuse me, by the time we were involved and we heard of it, we decided, well, first we tried to go to a couple of meetings and they would always get canceled or rearranged and at another place after we showed up where they said it was supposed to be. So finally we got to a meeting and what they were talking about sounded really good. I only had two kind of problems. So I would ask the question, did you talk to anyone who actually was displaced, who had to move from that time period and those neighborhoods? Crickets, no answer. And then it was like, well, because I was asked, well, don't I want my voice to be heard? And I said, well, I am one of the survivors. We had to move. We had to pack our bags, and so did our cousins. But I don't feel like it's like it would be my place to say anything because there are a lot of survivors. Did you look for them? Crickets, no answer. That's why I joined EDPA too, because that's a problem. When you say that you're trying to do this for my community and it's on the back of what my family had to suffer through, but you can't answer the basic questions of, did you ask us what we wanted?
Right.
And are we included in the process?
And even
the
though
answers so far to both of those questions were not answered. I'm not going to say it was a no, literally, they had to sit at breakout tables, one person from the head of the committee and another person at the table asking what appeared to be guided questions. So that was a little disturbing. But when I asked that person those two questions, no answer. So that tells me that you're really trying to make it look like we're all in agreement and this is going to benefit all of us, when in actuality, it's not. And that's what was done the first time.
Right.
And the second time and the third time. Eminent domain and redlining has a long history of just
And urban renewal, right.
manipulating people and hurting people around without any consequence and without any real value to the people that are being moved. So because we can read now, some of us get to say, stop that.
Right. And now go back to that TIF piece, because they put the Emmanuel property.
What is TIF?
I'm getting ready to tell you. They put it into what they call the interstate corridor. So
Recently.
basically, yeah, just recently. Got voted in, I think in December, right? And what TIF is, or actually where TIF started, was in California in 1952. And it was a way for urban renewal to blight communities. And that's how you define the land has to be blighted. And or it's what they call a but-for proposition. If they didn't help, the city didn't help spend the money for it to bring development in by giving tax abatements and stuff like that, then no developer would come into that community and build anything. And it really is much more intense than that, but I kept getting stuck by when Bobby and Bird and those guys would go to the meetings, because I didn't go to all the meetings, but I would watch the meetings after on television because they're public. And they kept saying, oh, well, you know, TIF dollars, we can't give you TIF dollars, which we weren't asking for that either, right? So they got $67 million to start, wait, let me finish.
On blighted property?
On blighted property, that they can start proposing to groups to build development, to build affordable housing, to which the majority of it, if not all of it, will be rental housing, which builds no wealth. Might be affordable, it's only affordable for some. It's not going to build any wealth for anybody over time. And it's based on the same rules of what eminent domain used to do. But because that makes them look bad, now they talk about putting it into corridors. When they build the affordable property, it raises the property taxes for everybody around where that building is structured. The developers get some sort of, all kinds of different kinds of relief, and it can be like tax abatement. So for maybe 20 years, they don't have to pay taxes on their building, right? And then supposedly at that point, they start bringing the TIF dollars back into the community. And it just really sent me on like another whole rabbit hole search, but it was like, what's the difference between that, what they were doing then and calling it eminent domain, and what they're doing now and redeveloping it, and then who gets that money?
And it kind of also raises the question of, if you have some property, because we're talking, what kicked this off for me was the Emmanuel property down on Russell and Williams. They left that property vacant for over 50 years with no development on it. So if you're calling that blight, then aren't you double dipping from the first time that you called it blight?
That part.
And do we get that money? No. But they're making money off of things like that, money off of the freeway entrance and exit. That they get paid for that ingress and regress. for that exit into a community, yeah, dollars come out of that. And so all of these dollars surrounding, quote unquote, the in the name of the Black community, they're surrounding dollars, but they never come to
Right.
that community.
And it's sort of like a glorified gentrification where you make sure you promise some affordable housing in the midst of the gentrification.
But I
it
don't
really
need
does
affordable
not
housing.
house, it really does not house people living in poverty, people that have been houseless because they don't qualify, because you have to have at least 30% of your income needs to be able to go towards renting. So that takes a lot of people out. There's a lot of people on fixed incomes. A lot of seniors can't even live on that.
Bingo. Like me, I'm a senior on a fixed income.
Right.
I'm a community treasure, so to speak, and I'm an artist, but I might as well almost be living on the street, except for an agency that has me do consulting for them, and they found me an apartment in their space. Before that, I was offered 3 affordable housing places that by the time I finished paying rent, electric, so on and so forth, food and so, I didn't make that much money to move in. It's kind of like they did the same thing with the artist lofts downtown in Northwest Portland, the Honeywell. I remember that. It was like, this is affordable housing for artists. I'm like, well, what artists are you talking about? They got to be an artist with a job and
with a consistent income, right?
And a consistent disposable income.
Right.
So you know that knocks most of us out of pocket right away. Okay, so just the problem with saying this is for the Black community is that you never deal with the initial issue that harmed people.
Right.
I got a problem with that.
Right.
It's like, well, it's so late now and we can't fix it. And then it's like, well, wait a minute. How do you know we can't fix it? You can fix stealing somebody's house by paying them for it.
Let me interrupt 1 second right there, because in reading about TIFs, I've been reading about them now for 2 weeks. Idaho has a TIF, and actually Oregon has the same piece in their TIF description. So there's a whole piece about preservation. TIFs don't have to be only building affordable housing. You could be restoring old housing, or you could be restoring houses people are already in. It's a whole discussion that you're supposed to be able to have. If they're involving community, it would be community members, the city, those two, the Housing Authority and the Development Commission. But it could be restoring properties. It could be homes that they're building for people to buy. And actually, if you listen to Portland Prosper, I can't remember the lady's name because she used to get on my very last nerve, bless her little heart. But she made it sound like, well, we are building affordable housing, but 2/3 of what they build is this affordable rentals. There's not that many, and then when you do have houses that you're built, they're only going to first-time home owners. You're still leaving a lot of seniors out because seniors can't get their houses remodeled. Seniors can't buy a new home because they're not a first-time homeowner. So you're still leaving a lot of Black folks out. So it's kind of interesting to me once I started reading what some other states were doing with their TIF dollars. The most famous TIF thing going on now is the Hudson Yards, which is in New York City, where they totally revamped the subway system and a whole bunch of other stuff. But again, there's affordable housing in there. Much of it is affordable rental. There's commercial properties in there that you can get at a reduced rate if you have some kind of income where you can afford commercial property. It all sounds good in theory, but who is it that you're really helping? And then who's really getting the benefit of whatever wealth is generated? Even most developers are taking a loss for the most part. Even with they say with the tax abatements, they end up ultimately taking a lot. They don't make that much money off of it. And so that's a little sketchy to me, because then my question was, then why are we doing it this way? Is there some new way to do it? Do we have to keep following the same system that always posed a barrier, as opposed to maybe people talk about, land grants and being a land developer? There are Black folks that have come together, gotten their land back in certain parts of certain cities, and they're developing their own thing. And it's building generational wealth through this land, they're called land trusts. You know what I'm saying? So there are places things are happening a little bit differently than here that you probably could talk people into. That probably would sound good. That's not really what Portland is doing right now. Because right now, their big ticket item is building this affordable housing. That still could possibly, in a depression, turn into a bunch of ghetto apartments eventually. But anyway, it's real interesting when you start doing the research.
Yeah. Kind of to that degree, we talk about basically like imagining a different way of doing things. I think one thing that really plays a role in that is the role of artists. And I know you all talked a little bit earlier about just even using family photos just as far as evidence, honestly, of saying, yeah, this is what you said was happening here. This is what was actually happening. We have the photos. But can you just talk a little bit more about kind of like using art both to like preserve this history, but also to engage people, such as those who are, younger generations and those outside?
So immediately after having a meeting with the mayor and EDPA2, I decided to create an art exhibit called Crossing the Red Line. And it's based on that red line theory, where I'm showing the Portland map, I'm showing the national map, because this was a national mandate put together by the realtors and the government to herd people around. And at the point during this meeting, when I was hearing some untruths, we'll put it that way, I decided, you know what, I'm going to use all of the information, well, not all of it because there's way too much, but some pertinent information about what they were saying about the community and juxtapose it against our family photos, along with some other photos, because we've received even more through 2 other sources, still based on our family, that show even clearer pictures. So I'm going to juxtapose those against each other so that you can watch what they say and then look at what it looked like. Because that's how I can speak much louder than getting on a microphone. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, we got, how many pictures do we? We have thousands of pictures. So now what are you going to do? You can't keep saying it was your way. And this has been the biggest piece right now, using social change as an artist. You can't keep saying it's your way when there's definite, obvious proof that that's not true, okay? And outside of calling people liars all the time, it's like when you're faced with the evidence, it's like history books, okay? Which We also know they're trying to revise history books right now so that things are diminished and reduced. Well, as part of those people who were affected, then the artists in that group are the ones who will speak the loudest. I was just watching a video last night of one of my mentors, Elio Pomari. He was from Colombia, but he was here in the United States and one of the best friends of James Baldwin. He taught me that we have our own resource material to work from, so I don't have to use ballet all the time, European ballet. And then he also taught me about all the pictures don't need to be cute and pretty. We need to show what's going on in the neighborhoods. Okay, that's our job, to enlighten people and reflect to them what's happening in our lives. So on that note, I decided, yeah, I'm gonna do an installation. I would love to project it on the bank tower downtown. And I'm sure there's some grant somewhere that will allow me to do that. But in the interim, I've had it up once at the Interstate Firehouse Cultural Center. I have a book, 2 other bookings coming up, and then I'm just now starting to work with a few artists from around the country who are doing the same type of work to clarify our history, archive it, book it, make curriculum out of it so people understand what's really going on. So that's just me, okay? Other artists do it different ways. I think I just finished talking to Daryl Grant. He's gonna do a musical piece about something like that coming up here shortly. So,
I was going to add to that too. It's also being able to give people the human beings that lived in a place. My whole piece and what I try to write about is identity, belonging, and place. You know, and it really is kind of, for me, because a lot of our family migrated out of Oklahoma 10 years before Tulsa burned, and they migrated out of the United States, period. They went to Canada and started 5 settlements or more, 7 settlements, I'm not exactly sure, several settlements in Western Canada. So, and just for me too, it's also to kind of let young people know that we have a hit. I mean, everything that you're studying about, World War I, Vietnam War, whatever, we had a place in there. We had a part in there. And to kind of stop allowing people to erase the fact that we were there, we were doing things, we were building things, we were creating,
inventing, we were doing all of that.
We are American history. And it's almost, to me, since I'm a retired teacher, if I could really create if I had my way, kids would learn their history through their own families, good, bad, or indifferent, because it's not going to all be pretty. But some of it's going to be so fascinating. Like, I just found out about a relative that we had that he was after Reconstruction, he was one of the senators in the US. So it was like, wow, our family, you know what I'm saying? Out of those people that settled in Canada, one of them's brother was a US senator. And that's like the second senator I found in our family. And
it's not to say we don't have the opposite in our family as well, okay? And it's just like for every Hollywood star we have in our family, there's also hillbillies, okay? Exactly. So,
and
you have to take that with a grain of salt, because family is family. You can't, like they say, you can't choose your family. Right. You can decide who you want to be around and who you don't.
Right.
But as we keep digging and finding this information, particularly in the sense of they saw Black Wall Street coming because they had already been burning towns down all over the United States. The Negro areas, Negro, the Black areas, they burned them down as soon as the people acquired anything.
In every
But I
new,
don't care what for, if it's jealousy or whatever, it really doesn't matter. It's like you want other people's stuff, so you're gonna go take it and kill them. That's the way it works. Well, when our family did move up there, guess what the Canadian government did? Requested the Ku Klux Klan to come up and surround them. And then all of a sudden, no more Negroes in Canada. I'm
right,
sorry.
they banned the rest. By 1916, they banned Negroes being able to come into Canada. And so our cousins up there are having the same battles we're having down here. You know what I'm saying? So it's very, very interesting. And actually, they said a lot of the influence of bringing the Klan up there came from the white settlers that came from Kansas and Oklahoma. And so it wasn't necessarily the Canadians themselves. It was the influence of the Canadians wanted white settlers. That part was true and racist. The Black folks came, they said, oh, you know, they're hardworking. We're going to let this first group in, which was our group. We're going to let them in. They're fine, you know?
Well, actually, it's not just let them in, because you had to have money to cross that border.
Well, that's true.
Per person.
And some of them, I just was reading in one of the Canadian books that we had more money than I thought we did, because they kept, everybody that I've talked to talked about how poor we were, but they sold everything. But they also had to book like 7 cars to get everything up there. So they were taking cattle up there, hogs up there, you know. So anyway.
On the Overground Railroad.
Yeah, you can, long story short, that's all traceable history, particularly at the Canadian end. It's more, it's in their history books, it's not in ours. But all around, I started reading newspapers from Kansas and Louisiana, and in every newspaper for a week for the year before they left, some Black person got murdered, hung, shot, burned out, or bombed. So even Tulsa, the Tulsa bombing was not a new thing. That was, they were bombing people all around. They bombed this guy that started a boarding house in Kansas somewhere. But it's just, we don't know that history. No one knows. Black folks don't talk about it. And now I understand why they didn't talk about it, because they wanted to just forget about it, because that's trauma.
And just be free and have a lifestyle.
But the reality,
this is what was happening here. And once again, it was destroyed. Right.
But at the same time, my grandfather used to tell me all the time, that saying about history is doomed to repeat itself if you don't face it. If you don't deal with it, then it's just gonna, 20 years later, here you go, you back in the place you were 20 years ago. And I used to think all the time when I was a kid, why does he say that? But now, after I talked to my brother this morning, these people are crazy. They want to repeat history.
That's not actually what she said, but we won't go there now. Okay.
It had cuss words in it, I'll say it. But anyway, you know, because even thinking about my daughter and I watched the Prince, but I guess he's not a prince anymore, of England and Meghan Markle. You know, people are crazy. It's crazy out here on these mean streets, as I tell people all the time, you know.
And wanting to keep it that way. So this is one of the reasons we've decided we're going to sit down, we're going to write this down, we're going to make a coffee table book out of it, a curriculum. I'm going to flash it up on top of the bank tower, and we will not be quiet about this. Right. You know, because it's happened too many times to too many people. It's just disgusting, and it's got to stop. And I'm literally, that statement, I'm quoting a 5-year-old who saw something that was wrong And that was her response to it. So for the people who don't want to raise up, it's okay, you know, but there's some of us who will.
So.
Too much?
Oh, no. That was perfect. I was just gonna, that was actually like, that would have been a great place to close, but I did want to say one more thing. You know, when you talked about Canada, because I'm not really familiar with that history, to be perfectly honest with you, but it made me think about the last time when Saya and I were in Vancouver. It was a few years ago. And it's one of those things where it's like, on one hand, it's like, you know, because they say, you know, Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, was it like San Francisco are kind of like the same city, just, you know,
yeah, it's a corridor.
So on one hand, it's like, you know, comfortable and familiar. But on the other hand, there's something in the air where it's like, this feels, you know, familiar and off, you know, like there's just something.
It's a different country.
Yeah, but you know, it just like, you know, but in these other places where like in the US, we don't talk about it, but we still talk about it more. But you know, I look at like Canada, I look at the UK, where it feels like there's this air of patting ourselves, or not patting ourselves, but basically white people patting themselves on the back for being more evolved or something. And it's not really, it's just like you don't talk about it, or you've found a way to talk about it a little bit less.
Now, when you read the stories, I'm going to send you a story, Bruce. It's from our great-great-great-grandmother, Maddie.
And Maddie? Our great-grandmother.
Right, okay. She's talking about...
I mean, great-aunt, great-great-aunt. Two times great-aunt.
Not Della, Maddie.
2 times great-aunt.
Okay.
She was on Della's aunt. So our 2 times great-aunt.
Okay, so, and she's talking about the last days of slavery in this article from 1948. And as I read it for the 7th time, in order to kind of understand her thinking and her talking and thinking about how our family is now, etc., you find that and this was an interview of her up there, and you find that so little has changed since those days of slavery. And you really read that out in her statements, because the same thing she said in 1948 about her childhood, and how old was she then? 90, 80 something?
I don't know which article you read, because they
about her childhood lets you know that this repetitive cycle of things will continue to be repetitive because people like it that way. And so right now, it doesn't matter if we upset the apple cart, because the apple cart doesn't work for us, you know? And the only thing I like to do with apples is put them in a pie. So if you're bringing me anything else, I don't want to do that. Let's change things so that it's equitable and usable for everyone. I got a couple calls to come do a few things for groups and agencies, and I'm really now just starting to tell them no, because you've gotten enough pay from my family to last me the rest of my life. So actually, I just like, stop doing that, okay? Or work it out where you start paying the people that you're asking to come do this stuff. Because it doesn't make sense after understanding slavery and after understanding Reconstruction and after understanding Jim Crow and after understanding George Floyd and after understanding that you keep repeating the same behavior. There's a psychological, pathological thing going on there that I just don't want to be a party to.
Yeah. So,
But yes, Canada, very, very different. And you probably have, you know, our relatives go from East Coast to West Coast in Canada. Same way relatives down here go from East Coast to West Coast. So we actually are North Americans, not just US citizens. Okay. And we need to operate like that now, because we can shift things around. It requires some reading and some research, and there's people around who are doing that, and you should be doing it for yourself. But I would say investigate everything, from the hospital to the vaccine to the mayor to the investigate all of it.